Alright, someone requested an open world Firebrand build, so here it is. If you would like to see other builds, don't hesitate to reach out. I can't promise my builds are the best, but I do promise that they work fine in the open world. One of Guardian's main strengths is their flexibility, so we're gonna play off that. I'll give you both an offensive and defensive setup that will work in any situation, but I'm gonna suggest quite a few alternatives for you to pick based on your own preferences. If you're new to making your own build, this might sound scary, but the base of this build will be solid enough for you to be able to pick any of the options I suggest and still do fine. Let's start with traits. Regardless of your preferences, pick up Radiance, which is all about burning and will increase your critical hit chance against burning foes, as well as provide you with increased ferocity. Radiance will also buff your Virtue 1 skill as well as renew it every time you kill a foe. As for the major traits, we'll go with Inner Fire, which will grant us Fury when we strike a foe that has more than 3 stacks of burning. Radiant Fire, which will give us access to Zealot's Flame whenever we critically strike a burning foe, as well as improve our Torch skills. And Amplified Wrath to increase our burning damage overall. For the second trait line, you'll have to make a choice between a defensive setup which will still kill regular enemies quite fast, or an offensive setup and rely on Firebrand's toolkit to stay alive in tough situations. Let's start with the offensive setup, for which we will pick Zeal. All minor traits will improve the power of the symbols we leave on the ground, as well as give us some nice bonuses such as resolution or inflicting vulnerability on our enemies. When it comes to the major traits, either pick up Zealous Scepter, which will grant you might whenever your Virtue 1 passive triggers, or if you don't need a might because you're consistently using the Jadebot protocols, you can pick up Fiery Wrath for increased strike damage to burning foes instead. The second major trait line will always be Kindled Zeal. This will improve your condition damage based on your power. And the Grandmaster trait will depend on your preferences once more. If you like running spirit weapons, go with Eternal Armory, which will make them burn foes on their first strike and give you an additional charge. If you'd rather not cast any spirit weapon, you can pick up Symbolic Avenger instead, which will increase your strike damage against enemies hit by your symbols. If you prefer a more defensive approach, you'll want to pick up Honor instead of Zeal. This trait line pairs exceptionally well with Celestial Armor and will offer you higher might generation. Your minor traits will grant you Vigor whenever you land a critical hit and will let your Virtue 2's passive regenerate your endurance faster, as well as adding a heal to all of your dodge rolls. As for the major traits, pick up Protector's Restoration, which will grant you protection every time you press your healing skill. Empowering Might for extra might generation when critically striking enemies, and Writ of Persistence, which will let symbols heal allies. I would suggest you play around with both the offensive and defensive trait line for a while and see which one you prefer. This is a Firebrand build, so our third trait line won't be a surprise to anyone. Firebrands are all about quickness, and their minor traits will also buff all of their virtues and overall stats. Your first major trait is rather flexible. If you stick with Axe, which is an excellent weapon by the way, pick up Unrelenting Criticism for some extra bleeding and daze. If you prefer killing your enemies with Tome of Justice, you can pick up Archivist of Whispers for some extra charges instead. The second trait will depend on whether you bring mantras or not. If you do, pick up Weighty Terms, which will reward you for using the final charge of your mantras by slowing down foes and granting you additional pages for your virtue skills. If you dislike the idea of running mantras, pick up Legendary Lore instead, which will grant you a buff based on the virtue you're using. Our Grandmaster trait will always be Quickfire, which will make sure we never lose our Virtue 1 passive even when it's on cooldown. And it'll add some burning whenever we're providing quickness. I already mentioned flexibility being one of Firebrand's main strengths, and you will see this in our utility skills. I will recommend a general setup that will work regardless of your trait choices, but I'm gonna add a few more suggestions for you to try out as well. Guardians have one of the most overpowered healing skills, but only when you use it right. Litany of Wrath will only heal you for a very small amount, but it's also going to heal you based on the damage you inflict on your enemies for the next 6 seconds. So whenever you use this skill, make sure you follow it up by other offensive skills. If you chose Firebrand's Weighty Terms trait, which improves the mantras, you could also consider running Mantra of Solace instead. And if you want a full passive approach, you can also go with Signet of Resolve. A general all-purpose setup for the 3 utility skills would be Sword of Justice, Mantra of Flame and Purging Flames. The latter is really great by the way. It's a damaging AoE, a fire field and it'll cleanse a condition of you. Once you get comfortable playing your Firebrand, these are the 3 traits you will swap the most depending on the situation. If you want to stack more mantras and play off the weighty terms trait, you could add Mantra of Lore or Truth for extra condition cleanse and blinds on demand. If you dislike casting Sword of Justice, simply take it off your bar for any of the mantras or stand your ground if you want extra stability or hold the line for some extra protection. And if you want to cruise through the open world with only passive utilities, you could add Bane Signet for extra power, Signet of Wrath for extra condition damage, and Signet of Judgment for extra defense. The idea of a lazy full Signet build sounds so enticing to me, I'm gonna add a third build link in the pinned comments that is fully passive. And that brings me to the elite skill, where the standard pick should be Feel My Wrath for quickness and fury. But if you tend to neglect pressing your elite skill, pick up Signet of Courage instead and you'll enjoy a ridiculous amount of sustain. When it comes to gear, I already mentioned Celestial stats in the previous part of my video. This is my favorite stat combination for Firebrands, especially in the open world, as we will make use of all of the stats provided by this set. If you prefer a full offensive setup, you could consider Vipers instead. Your main weapons will always be Axe and Torch with sigils of Smoldering and Bursting. Generally, Firebrands will benefit from picking up a Scepter for their second set. But since this is an open world build, feel free to experiment with your second weapon setup. Both Sword and Greatsword will offer you higher burst damage, and Staff is really great when you're mainly doing meta events. I'm gonna add 3 builds in the pinned comments. One will be a full offensive trade line setup, one with a more defensive approach, and the third will be a full passive build with only signets. If you have any other comments or questions, feel free to ask them down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.